much. It's a great pleasure to speak on these topics. They are really so important. We're facing a storm of antimicrobial resistance. So today's lectures will both deal with how we cope with this storm, and the first one, as Anthony has said, will be on prudent use of antibacterial drugs, and then we'll come on to talking about how to prevent infections and the importance of hygiene. So the topics today then will be, in the first lecture, the challenges of antimicrobial resistance, how to use empirical therapy in the most efficient way. Then we'll move on to dealing with multi-resistant infections and come back then at the end to guidelines for prudent antimicrobial use and their implementation. So the thing to remember is that antimicrobial use generates resistance, and it always has done so. And in fact, when Alexander Fleming first discovered penicillin, in fact, very soon after that, he began to recognize that resistance existed. And we have some very interesting data that's been generated recently to show that antibiotic resistance is much more ancient than that. And this is a letter from the Lancet, published in 2011. And what these authors did was to sample 30,000-year-old Beringian permafrost sediments in Alaska and to isolate the genes from this material. So these are bacterial genes. And what they found was a highly diverse collection of genes encoding resistance to beta-lactam, tetracycline, and glycopeptide antibiotics. And when they did structure and function studies on the vancomycin-resistant element, they showed that it was similar to modern variants. So what they showed in effect is that bacteria have been attacking each other with antibiotics and defending each other with resistance for tens of thousands of years, probably millions of years. And what this means is that they've already developed all of the resistance mechanisms that we will ever find. And they've also developed all of the antibiotics that we will ever find. So we will never defeat them by creating new and powerful antibiotics. What we must do is to use antibiotics in a strategic way so that they will continue to work. And that's what prudent antimicrobial use is all about. So when we use antibiotics, we drive antimicrobial resistance, so we select resistant organisms. And this is called selection pressure. And in fact, use by all the different sectors of medicine will in fact drive this selection pressure. So if we look at it, we can see that we have a very large number of different organizations using antibiotics. Probably the greatest use is in hospital medicine and general practice and the related areas such as old people's homes. But we use substantial amounts also in farm animal practice, much less in growth promotion, probably in the West anyway. But actually, as we've reduced growth promotion use, we've increased the amount we use in farm animal practice because we have had to control diseases which were perhaps partly controlled when antibiotics were used for growth promotion. So substantial use there, and surprisingly, an awful lot used in other areas of food production. So in agriculture, for instance, fruit is sprayed with antibiotics. This was a surprise for me when I discovered it a few years ago. But every year in the United States, tons of antibiotics are used to protect fruit. A growing area, of course, is aquaculture. Huge amounts of antimicrobials used in aquaculture, and probably excessive use in many cases. And of course, this drives resistance. We, in small animal practice, use much less, but because we are so close to our patients, because we're so close to our clients, and because they go straight into the community, we have a particularly strong responsibility to make sure that we do not generate and spread resistant bacteria. So I thought that what I'd do to introduce this lecture would be to talk about the way in which MRSA invaded the medical field, particularly in the UK, because this illustrates to us what can happen, what could go wrong, and gives us pointers towards the solutions. And this is particularly relevant at the moment because we face a really major challenge from methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus pseudointermediates now. which is beginning to spread throughout Europe and invade Britain. And this, I think, has lots of parallels with MRSA. So down here at the bottom we have our chart with the years from 1960 to 2005. And if we go right to the beginning, we can see that in the 1960s in hospitals, there was quite a high incidence of infection caused by what they called the hospital staph. This was a methicillin-sensitive Staph aureus. It was type 80/81, and it produced a rather nasty toxin called pantom-valentin leukocidin, and it caused very unpleasant soft tissue infections. So this was quite a severe infection, and as you can see, the incidence of it was quite high, and then this began to come down in the late 1960s. And this is because at that time, antibiotics which would deal with penicillinase began to be produced. And one of these was methicillin. And very soon after it appeared, the first MRSA was discovered and described by a group led by Jevons. So it was called the Jevons MRSA. And this was the first inkling that we might have a problem with this organism. About that time, also, new antibiotics came out, so we had cotrimoxazole and aminoglycosides appearing, and what these did was to enable us to control organisms such as the Jevons MRSA. So you can see at the top, we've got 5% as the sort of peak of, these are bacteremias in human hospitals, and then with these new antibiotics, this was brought down under control to a lower level. And in fact, people thought that that was the solution. So these antibiotics were then being used over a period of about 10 years to control the infections, and it seemed to work well. And we call this the decade of complacence, because really this was the wrong way to handle things. So in Britain, I'm afraid, we went on depending on antibiotics to some extent to deal with MRSA, whereas in other countries, particularly, for instance, in Scandinavia, they started to try to identify and exclude MRSA so that treatment wasn't required. And they've managed historically to keep the levels of bacteremias in hospitals down below 1%, whereas, as we shall see, it got much worse than that in Britain. So we continued to use antibiotics, and in the late 70s we had new penicillins and cephalosporins appearing, and about this time a new type of MRSA appeared called epidemic MRSA, and here you can see EMRSA1 appearing at that time. And then we had EMRSA2, EMRSA3 was more severe, and so on, until in the late 80s and early 90s, EMRSA15 appeared, and this continues to be a major problem. So this is one of the major causes of MRSA infection in human hospitals throughout the world, but particularly in Europe. EMRSA16 appeared around that time as well, and you can see, if you look at the top graph again, that the levels of MRSA went from 2% right up to 40%. So at that time, we in the UK were amongst the worst in Europe in terms of our MRSA bacteremias in hospitals. So our reputation was really bad. Of course, MRSA continued to develop, and in the sort of mid-90s, we had the appearance of the community-associated MRSA. This was another PBL-positive MRSA, in other words, causing nasty soft tissue infections, and it appeared in the community. So it wasn't a hospital infection, and it would affect healthy people, so groups of soldiers or athletes. So really nasty infections with deaths and so on, quite unpleasant. That is still a problem, but it's not as bad as the hospital problem, certainly in the UK. In America, the CA MRSA is by far the biggest problem. So it has a lot of potential to cause disease. Then, at the end of the 90s, we began to recognize MRSA in pets, in companion animals, and this continues to be a problem. These animal MRSAs at that time were always, or nearly always, EMRSA 15, and the evidence subsequently has shown that these come directly or indirectly from human hospitals. So that is a source, if you like, of infection into the veterinary